Hello, viewers. Change the angle. Keep the facts. We revisit treaties, campaigns, and outcomes by the numbers. Stay to the end and draw your own conclusion. September 1851. Horse Creek near Fort Laramie, Nebraska Territory. Delegations from Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara gather beside the Platte while United States commissioners pitch a treaty tent and open their ledgers. The trail ruts to Oregon and California cut through Buffalo Range. Mail wagons rattle past village trails. The meeting is quiet in tone, but heavy in consequence. Can roads, forts, and emigrant passage coexist with sovereign homelands defined by seasons, hunts, and council law? This episode follows the chain from Horse Creek to the Black Hills in 1807 and asks a direct question. How did a series of agreements that named territories, promised annuities, and recognized hunting rights turn into a map of reservations, reductions, and contested statutes? Along the southern plains, Kiowa Comanche and Plains Apache face the same pressure at Fort Atkinson and later at Medicine Lodge Creek. In the northern Rockies, Blackfeet neighbors sign at Judith River, while in the Mountain West, Salish Pen Doré and Kootenai accept a reserved homeland under the Hellgate Treaty. Each paper fixes a boundary on land that had long been managed by kinship routes and winter counts. The actors are clear: tribal leaders who speak for bands and villages, Army officers and Indian agents who promise protection of roads and posts, commissioners whose authority rests on signatures and the power to survey and garrison. The stakes are exact: safe passage for migrants against the survival of buffalo economies and river villages, a legal language of consent against the fact of settlement and mineral rush. The central problem is not a single battle, but a sequence. When the text says permanent home and requires 3/4 consent for any future cession, what happens when gold is reported in the Black Hills and Congress moves by statute? The answer begins at Horse Creek and runs forward in dates, names, and places. Winter 1849, Washington City. The Office of Indian Affairs shifts from the War Department to the Department of the Interior, signaling a policy turn from frontier campaigns to administration by treaties, agencies, and annuities. 2 railroad statutes fix the economic horizon. The Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 opens the Central Corridor to survey and settlement. The Pacific Railway Act in 1862 commits a steel road up the Platte and over the Divide. Each mile of grade demands right-of-way, timber water, and armed protection. The Homestead Act in 1862 promises farm claims on surveyed land, drawing migrants through the same river valleys that sustain buffalo and village fields. On the ground, the prelude is a line of dates and posts. August 1854 near Fort Laramie. A clash later called the Grattan Affair breaks a fragile peace and hardens views on both sides. In 1858, the Pikes Peak Rush pushes miners into the South Platte and Arkansas Forks. In 1862, steamboats carry war materiel up the Missouri to Fort Union, Fort Berthold, and Fort Rice, while the Union Pacific grading crews push west along the Platte from Nebraska Territory. In 1864, Colorado volunteers strike a Cheyenne and Arapaho camp at Sand Creek, forcing a new round of councils and claims. In 1806, the Army builds Forts Reno, Phil Kearny, and C.F. Smith on the Powder River route, igniting Red Cloud's war along the Bozeman Trail. The Fetterman fight in December 1806 shows the cost of holding an unwanted road. In 1867, the Indian Peace Commission forms and begins large multi-tribe councils on Medicine Lodge Creek in the south and at Fort Laramie in the north. In 1871, Congress ends the practice of ratifying new treaties as treaties under constitutional form, and shifts to agreements and statutes, but existing treaties remain in force. In the summer of 1874, a military expedition enters the Black Hills and reports gold. In 1875, federal negotiators seek a sale. Lakota leaders refuse. In early 1876, an ultimatum orders all northern bands to report to agencies by a winter deadline or be treated as hostile. The war season follows, and with it, rations withheld and agency pressure. In 1807, Congress removes the Black Hills by statute. Objectives diverge and harden. United States officials aim to guarantee uninterrupted transit for emigrants, mail and telegraph, to protect rail and mining districts, and to concentrate tribes near agencies where schooling, farming, and ration issue can be measured. They seek fixed jurisdiction survey lines and the legal authority to build forts and roads. The constraints are real. Civil War mobilization draws regulars away from the plains. Supply trains to Fort Laramie and Bozeman road posts depend on long hauls from the Missouri and the Platte. Agency operations are vulnerable to fraud and delay in transport seasons. Political pressure from territories and railroad companies compresses negotiating timelines. 4. Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, Kiowa, Comanche plains, Apache, and allied bands. The objective is to preserve homelands, hunting circuits, and sacred districts while reducing intertribal conflict around the trails. Leaders want compensation and reliable goods for passage rights already taken in practice. They want the power to regulate who moves through their country and to protect places such as the Black Hills from prospecting camps. Their constraints mount each year. The buffalo herds contract under commercial hunting and rail access. Epidemics strike village settlements and winter camps. Fort chains and emigrant roads cut through choke points at river fords and mountain passes. Rival territorial claims between nations complicate unified bargaining at large councils. Logistics drive outcomes. On the United States side, the network runs by river and rail. Missouri River steamboats deliver flour, coffee, sugar, and ammunition to upper posts each navigation season. Wagon columns haul beef on the hoof and issue blankets and tools at agency warehouses. The Platte Corridor carries rails, ties, and telegraph wire to the Union Pacific grade, with escort detachments from Fort Kearny and Fort Laramie. In the mountains, the Bozeman Trail forts require constant convoy protection and burn through forage and firewood at winter rates that strain garrisons. On the tribal side, mobility is the strength. Mounted hunters and war parties can choose ground, avoid fixed posts, and converge on convoys at river crossings. Wintering grounds along sheltered timber and cutbanks fix seasonal cycles. When rations are cut or delayed at agencies during cold months, families move to find game or to avoid disease in crowded encampments, raising the chance of armed contact with patrols. Policy and administration shift in step with these pressures. Treaty texts in the 1850s promise annuities in measured dollars per year, blacksmiths, teachers, and mills on site. After the Peace Commission period, the government increasingly ties subsistence to residents near agency school attendance for children and the adoption of farming with issued tools and livestock. Military jurisdiction narrows as interior agents request troops to enforce agency rules, escort survey parties, or compel returns after winter hunts. In practice, violations flow from both directions. Unauthorized miners cross into reserved land. Retaliatory raids cut trail traffic. Ration schedules slip with late steamers or light appropriations. Arrests of headmen at posts or disarmament orders at issue grounds spark confrontations that ripple beyond the agency lines. By 1874 to 1876, the system reaches a breaking point. Northern Pacific surveys probe the Yellowstone, while news of gold turns the Black Hills into a magnet inside the Great Sioux Reservation. The government's objective becomes purchase or seizure to regularize a situation already created on the ground. Lakota objectives center on holding the hills under the Consent Clause written in 1868 and maintaining hunting rights in the unceded country while game lasts. Each side reads the same treaty words against a different clock. The United States measures progress by miles of track and the flow of freight. Tribal leaders measure survival by winters fed and the integrity of named places. The buildup ends when statute displaces consent and the treaty chain gives way to an act that redraws the map. Late November 1864, Sand Creek, Colorado Territory. Snow dusts the bends of Big Sandy Creek and frost grips the grass. A mixed camp of southern Cheyenne and Arapaho under Black Kettle and White Antelope shelters in Cottonwood Bends near Fort Lyon. At first light, the 3rd Colorado attacks. The fight is brief and one-sided. Smoke rises into a hard blue sky. Couriers ride for Denver with news of a victory. Refugee bands move south toward the Arkansas and north toward the Smoky Hill. The trail zones become armed corridors. Mail stations fortify. Interpreters at Bent's New Fort and at Fort Larned translate claims and counterclaims about flags of truce and prior assurances. The immediate effect is displacement. Villages break apart to find winter forage and safety. The policy effect is councils. The following year, on the Little Arkansas, United States commissioners gather Southern Cheyenne Arapaho and Plains Apache to seek an end to raids and to move camps toward specified agency sites. The Southern Plains War does not end. Raids and reprisals escalate along the Arkansas and the Santa Fe crossings. The Colorado line becomes a signal point. Watch details track smoke by day and fire by night across open country, where telegraph poles are still sparse and riders carry most warnings. December 1806, Fort Phil Kearny on Piney Creek. The Bozeman Trail cuts between the Bighorn Mountains and the Powder River. Winter closes the high passes and locks wagon ruts into ice. The garrison runs daily wood trains to fuel the post. Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho parties contest the road at every crossing. On December 21, a decoy lures a relief column beyond signal range of the fort guns. The fight ends on a ridgeline in drifting snow. By evening, the post commander counts the dead by lantern light. The telegraph to Fort Laramie carries a terse report through storm breaks when the wire holds. Couriers on the Platte Road carry the same message to department headquarters. The effect is immediate on both sides. The Army reinforces but cannot keep the road open through winter. Tribal councils read the pattern in the wood train schedule and strike the convoys that keep the fort alive. In summer, 1867 and 1868, small actions repeat the same logic. The United States must hold 3 posts along a long, thin supply line. Mounted parties can choose where and when to cut it. The Indian Peace Commission reaches the north with a proposal: close the road, abandon the forts, establish a permanent home on the Missouri West Bank, recognize an unceded hunting district north and west while game lasts. The Army burns Forts Reno Phil Kearny and C.F. Smith in 1868 as it withdraws. The immediate effect is a reset in the northern corridor. Wagon trains shift to safer routes. The deeper effect is a written consent rule that will frame every later argument about land cession. April 1868, Fort Laramie. The treaty text names a reservation and a rule for any future change. No cession of any portion of the reservation herein, described which may be held in common, shall be valid as against said Indians unless executed by at least 3/4 of all the adult male Indians occupying or interested in the same Treaty of Fort Laramie treaty text, Fort Laramie, 1868, 04-29. The words are plain. The meaning will be tested when gold is found. July 1874. Black Hills High summer. A military expedition under a cavalry column enters the hills from the north. Pickets cut trails through lodgepole pine. Survey parties hammer stakes. Civilian packers pan creeks at lunch halts. Reports of color in the pan move by courier to the column command tent and out by telegraph when riders reach line of sight with stations on the plains. Newspapers reprint the first mentions within weeks. By autumn, small parties of miners probe canyons that treaty text placed inside the reservation. Agency headmen lodge protests with interpreters at Fort Laramie and at the Platte bridges. The immediate effect is pressure at the camp edges and on the game bands that hold the late summer hunts together. The government objective shifts to purchase. Commissioners ask for a price in dollars for the hills. The answer at councils along the White River is refusal. Leaders insist on the consent rule written in 1868. Winter 1874 to 1875 brings heavy snow on the northern plains. Supply trains to agencies run late. Beef issue schedules slip. Hunters follow elk into the breaks where survey crews also move. Reports of assaults and expulsions flow both ways along the telegraph and by agency courier. The wires carry terse requests for troops to escort surveyors and to keep miners from claim jumping inside the boundary. Enforcement is uneven. The number of intruders grows with each thaw. Autumn 1875, Red Cloud Agency on the White River. A commission meets with Lakota leaders under a canvas fly. Annuities goods stack in guarded piles. Translators render questions about a sale or a long lease. The answer remains no. The commission reports to Washington that purchase will not succeed. Over winter, the policy narrows to coercion. An order sets a deadline in late January 1876 for all northern bands to report to agencies or be classed as hostile. The season is the hardest for travel. Snow closes passes and ice makes crossings dangerous for families. Rations at agencies tighten as appropriations lag and freight slows. Issue days bring long lines and short waits. Disarmament orders at the corrals lead to brief fights. Scouts ride out to find holdouts. The immediate effect is to push people off the White River and up the Tongue and Powder to better hunting and to space out from disease in crowded agency camps. The strategic effect is to fuse a police action into a campaign when orders to compel returns meet fresh snow and scattered bands. Spring 1876. Yellowstone and Tongue River country. Army columns advance from the east and west. Steamboats carry rations and ammunition up the Missouri to the supply base below the mouth of the Yellowstone. Couriers pass between columns because telegraph gaps leave long, silent stretches. Scouts report large villages moving with the grass green up. Skirmishes at fords and coulees signal that the treaty lines no longer match the facts on the ground. At the same time, the Black Hills fill with prospectors beyond any realistic chance of removal. Agency officials record ration shortfalls by the pound against schedules written in the 1868 text. Tribal leaders track losses in horses and in the number of safe wintering places. Each week adds families to the movement away from agency control and into the unceded country where food and space still exist. Seizures of miners on reservation ground and seizures of horses near wagon roads trigger retaliations that repeat the cycle. The rising incidents do not follow a single valley. They repeat across two theaters. In the south after Sand Creek, the Medicine Lodge settlements concentrate people near agencies and put hunting rights into an unoccupied lands clause that weakens as buffalo decline. In the north, after the Bozeman Trail is closed, the Black Hills become the pressure point first by report and rumor, then by pick and stamp mill. Signals travel by wire when there is wire, and by rider when snow or distance cuts the line. Delays matter. A telegram sent at noon in Omaha becomes a courier packet handed over at midnight on the Platte. An interpreter repeats a phrase from an order as a man lays down a rifle at an issue gate. A misread date in a deadline letter means a scout party leaves a day late and finds a village already gone. The result is the same everywhere. Displacements accelerate. Skirmishes accumulate along rivers that treaties had tried to place outside the traffic lanes. The pressure crests into the campaign year that will set the stage for the Black Hills seizure by statute. March 1876, Northern Plains. Winter still holds the high country. The Department of the Interior deadline has passed. Bands that did not report to agencies by late January are classified as hostile, and the War Department is tasked to compel returns. The combat path forms along three axes. From the south, Brigadier General George Crook marches up the Platte toward the Powder and Tongue rivers with columns of infantry and cavalry and a mixed scout screen. From the east, Brigadier General Alfred Terry moves up the Yellowstone by steamboat with supplies and cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, earmarked as the striking arm. From the west, Colonel John Gibbon advances from the Montana Territory posts along the Yellowstone with infantry, a small cavalry detachment, and mountain howitzers. The plan is simple on paper. Converge on the unceded country. When grass comes, fix large villages and drive them toward agency control. Logistics set the limits. Every mile from the steamboat landings thins ammunition and rations. Every day before full green-up weakens horse strings and mule teams. The opposing force is fluid. Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho families move with the season, seeking fresh grass and game and avoiding posts. Council leadership is distributed by camp. War leaders mass strength when needed and disperse before columns can bring them to ground. Rules of engagement travel on thin paper. Agency orders speak of arresting headmen who refuse to remain near issue grounds and of seizing horses used in raids. Army field orders speak of disarming bands found away from agencies after the deadline and of destroying food caches to force compliance. A short directive summarizes the task: compel the return of all non-agency Indians to their proper agencies. Destroy such supplies as sustain resistance. Department Order Operations Instruction. Dakota Territory, 1-1876-03. Interpreters carry these phrases from tents to parade grounds and out along the columns. On the other side, the rule is survival. Keep non-combatants ahead of the columns, keep the horse herd sound, draw the enemy off balance, and break contact before concentration can occur. First contact on scale comes on June 17 at the Rosebud. Crook's column advances up Rosebud Creek. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne under Crazy Horse and allied leaders strike from the ridges and coulees. The ground is broken by ravines and benches. Horse herds and pack trains are choke points. The fight lasts hours as wings probe and withdraw. Crook's infantry fires controlled volleys to cover the cavalry, and his scouts counter multiple envelopments. When ammunition mules grow thin and water runs low, Crook halts and turns back toward Goose Creek to reorganize. The immediate effect is to remove one arm of the planned convergence. Crook will not be on the Little Bighorn when Terry and Gibbon move. Casualty ranges at Rosebud are moderate but telling. United States losses run in the dozens killed and wounded. Lakota and Cheyenne losses are comparable by contemporary estimates, though counts vary because families remove their wounded and dead. Fact versus folklore, later retellings either inflate numbers to call the fight a near disaster or minimize it as a mere check. The contemporaneous reports describe a hard action that forced an operational pause. Terry issues movement orders on the Yellowstone. The Custer Battalion rides up the Rosebud and then cuts a dry divide toward the Little Bighorn. Scouts report a very large village on the river with multiple circles and heavy pony dust. The terrain ahead is cut by bluffs, timbered bottoms, and ford points that channel movement. Communications degrade. There is no wire across the divide, and couriers ride long loops to pass messages. On June 25, the 7th Cavalry makes contact. The battalion divides into wings to fix the village and to find crossings. Pressure mounts quickly as the size of the encampment becomes clear. Fighting runs from the timber on the south end of the village to the high bluffs north of the main ford. By the morning of June 26, the northern wing is overrun on broken ridge lines. The Reno and Benteen elements hold a defensive position above the valley through the day and night. Gibbon and Terry reach the field on the 27th. After action counts for the United States list more than 260 dead and many wounded. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne casualties are in the dozens by most tribal and Army estimates. Exact numbers remain debated because losses were dispersed among camps and carried away. Fact versus folklore. Later narratives often claim the encampment reached impossible sizes or that a single tactical error determined the outcome. The record shows a large village with many fighting men command divided by ground and speed, and a series of local fights decided by numbers, position, and timing. The campaign does not end with that field. Through July and August, columns harry moving camps, seize stock when they can, and destroy food stores at creek bottoms and cutbanks. The target is not set-piece battle. It is pressure on sustainment. In early September, a strike at Slim Buttes captures a small village food stores and horses, and signals that even remote camps are within reach of hungry columns operating on short rations. The humanitarian ledger deepens. Non-combatants absorb the shock when lodges and winter stores are burned. A hard winter looms with reduced horse herds and broken cash pits. Agency administrators record ration deficits in pounds of beef and flour per person per issue day as appropriations lag and freight windows close. The military records list horse losses by the score from exhaustion and lack of forage during long chases that outrun supply wagons. Telegraph nodes shorten delays along the Yellowstone and Missouri, but many orders still ride by courier through storms. Parallel to movement in the field, a policy path tightens around the Black Hills. The government has already shifted from purchase to seizure. Negotiations at Red Cloud Agency in the autumn of 1875 failed to obtain consent to sell or lease. The consent clause from the 1868 treaty requires 3/4 of adult men to sign any future cession. The statute path begins when Congress attaches appropriations riders, conditioning rations on agreement to new terms, and then advances a bill to remove the hills and to consolidate agencies on the Missouri. Committees hear testimony on the impossibility of keeping minors out and on the expense of military protection. The document that moves forward in early 1807 is framed not as a treaty but as an act. Its enforcement sequence is simple. Close the agencies on the White River. Relocate to the Missouri where supply by steamboat is cheaper and easier to police. Open the Black Hills to mineral entry and survey. The on-the-ground effects appear in weeks. Agency camps dismantle. New agency sites on the river receive an influx of families who have endured a winter of short rations and the loss of stock. Disease rises in crowded camps. Work crews cut timber on the hills with legal cover. Survey parties mark town sites and claims. 2 short documents bracket the turn. You will cooperate with the agent in disarming and bringing in all Indians found off their reservations after the date named. Department Order Field Instruction Camp on Powder River 1876-02. And later, after Congress acts a terse line in a departmental circular, the Black Hills are withdrawn from the reservation and will be treated as public domain under the laws now in force. Interior Circular Policy Notice. Washington City, 1/1877-03. Between those lines are burned cash pits, steamboat manifests of flour and coffee, hospital ledgers at Missouri agencies, and delayed trains of annuity goods stacked in warehouses waiting on appropriations. Resistance and negotiation continue, even as the statute takes effect. Some leaders sign under pressure to secure immediate rations for their people. Others refuse and move north toward the international border, seeking space beyond the new enforcement line. Fact versus folklore. Popular tales often compress this period into a single defiant gesture or a single surrender. The record shows multiple councils, small fights, and a steady administrative squeeze. Arrests of named men occur when they come near agency gates. Scouts who had served with columns are attacked by their former enemies, and sometimes by those they once guided. Families split across options, with some moving to river agencies and others following remaining herds and then crossing into British territory. By summer 1807, the campaign is a ledger more than a map. On one side, miles marched animals, lost rations issued, and acts passed. On the other, lodges burned, horses seized, cash pits destroyed, and children counted at issue tables for reduced beef and flour. Casualty numbers from set-piece battles are now only a fraction of the harm. Most deaths come from exposure disease and hunger in the year after the main fights. Logistics have done their work. The Black Hills no longer sit inside a reservation boundary on federal maps. The agencies stand on the Missouri, where steamboats can deliver at scale. The consent clause remains in the text, but has been overridden in practice by statute. Historians will later mark the difference between a treaty promise and a congressional act, and courts will take up the question. On the ground in 1807, the march and the docket converge in the same place. The hills are lost, the camps are moved, and the chain of treaties has become an argument that will outlive everyone who signed them. Early March 1807 Missouri River Agencies. Ice still rims the bends. Orders arrive from Washington to close the White River agencies and consolidate people on the Missouri. The Black Hills are declared open to survey and mineral entry. The turning point is not a single fight, but a coordinated shift from field pressure to statute and enforcement. The objective on the United States side is to regularize a situation created by 2 seasons of uncontrolled mining. The constraint is legitimacy. The 1868 consent rule requires 3/4 of adult men to agree to any cession. The operational answer is to move rations posts and jurisdiction first and to settle the paper afterward. At Red Cloud Agency and Spotted Tail Agency officers read the circular, while quartermasters tally flour and beef by the pound. Wagons roll north toward the river landings at Fort Randall and Fort Pierre. Interpreters explain that issue will continue if people move, and that hunting in the unceded district is ending as stockmen and surveyors arrive. The weather is late winter hard. Snow squalls slow teams. Horse strings are weak after a year of chasing columns and thin grazing. The immediate effect is loss of initiative for bands that had hoped to winter out and choose their own return. Families uproot on short notice and follow the freight trail toward the river sites. Those who refuse break off and head for Powder River and the Yellowstone, or farther toward the international line. The constraint on the tribal side is food. Agency ledgers show ration deficits measured in pounds per person per issue day. Delays stack up when steamboats cannot move until the thaw. Children and elders feel the gap first. Spring storms catch wagon trains with lodges half struck and goods still in the cache pits. Hospital tents fill with measles and lung sickness in crowded camps near the new agency lines. Army detachments enforce the move with disarmament orders at issue gates and with patrols that seize horse herds used to raid or to range away from the reservation perimeter. By April, a policy outcome becomes visible on the ground. The Black Hills have sawmills running under survey stakes. Claim markers rise on creeks first scouted 3 summers earlier. Agency maps serve a new purpose. They count families at fixed points for ration issue and school enrollment. The consent clause remains in the treaty text. It no longer governs movement. The legal fight is deferred to committees and courts. The human effects are immediate. Winter counts for 1877 will mark a hard year. Lodges burn in enforcement sweeps. Names appear in narrow lines in agency death lists. Crazy Horse surrenders in May at Red Cloud Agency after a winter without secure hunting and dies in September at Camp Robinson after a struggle during arrest. Sitting Bull refuses the move and crosses into British territory at Wood Mountain with several hundred people to avoid the new enforcement ring. The field campaign that set this turn shows its limits at the same moment. Columns can seize stock and burn stores, but cannot feed entire populations through a winter without steady appropriations and transport. Officers report horse losses by the score from starvation during long scouts that run ahead of wagon trains. Ammunition is adequate, but food and forage are not. The new policy therefore moves the supply problem to the river. Steamboats can deliver flour coffee and beef on the hoof at scale to Standing Rock Cheyenne River and Lower Brule. The strategic initiative shifts decisively to the United States. Control is exercised through rations police and school regimes at fixed agencies rather than through attempts to hold a road in the unceded country. One admission against interest sits in the written record of the later review of these moves. A more ripe and rank case of dishonorable dealings will never in all probability be found in our history. United States Court of Claims Judicial Opinion, Washington City, 1975. So 7. The line looks back from a courtroom at what agency officers and commissioners knew in 1876 and 1807. Minors were not removed. Consent was not obtained. Statute displaced treaty. Consider a narrow counterfactual tied to constraints named at the time. If steamboat logistics had failed in spring 1877 and appropriations had not covered beef and flour, the agencies on the Missouri would have faced famine. Families would have scattered back to river breaks and coulees for elk and fish, and enforcement detachments would have been stretched thin across hundreds of miles. The consolidation might have stalled. Consider another. If the 1874 expedition had been barred from the Black Hills after its return, and miners expelled through 1875 with sustained patrols, the consent clause might have held longer. Pressure would still have mounted from rail surveys and buffalo decline, but the hills would not have become the immediate fulcrum. The actual path followed the structural forces set in motion years earlier. The Pacific Railway Act and Homestead Act pulled population through the Platte and up the Missouri. The Buffalo crash removed the seasonal safety valve, that once let hunting rights carry families through lean agency issue. The administrative shift from the War Department to the Department of the Interior created a system that measured compliance in pounds of rations and days of school attendance. The 1871 end of treaty making as a formal constitutional instrument cleared a procedural route for agreements and riders that acted like treaties without the same standard of consent. Each of these forces surfaced in the winter and spring when the consolidation orders went out and when the Black Hills were declared open. The human cost is counted in named places and named people. Red Cloud and Spotted Tail hold their agencies together under pressure while arguing for food and fair dealing. Gall carries families north along the Yellowstone after the 1876 campaign season and then faces the same winter shortages as everyone else. At Standing Rock and Cheyenne River, the death lists include infants lost to coughing sickness in canvas shelters and elders weakened by reduced meat issue. Winter counts mark the year as the time of the agency move, or the time of short beef. Displacement paths run visible on a map: White River to Missouri landings, Tongue River to the international boundary. Wind River holds but will lose land in later surveys and acts. The Black Hills move from a named homeland inside a reservation to a mining district on federal plats in a single legislative season. By late summer 1807, the initiative shift is complete. Military columns are no longer driving large encampments in open country. Agency police and army detachments enforce rules at fixed points. Hunters who leave the lines risk arrest and loss of stock. Resistance continues in smaller bands and in court petitions and delegations to Washington. The tactical fights of 1876 have given way to administrative pressure measured by ledger entries and school rosters. The central question posed at Horse Creek is answered in a new way. Roads and forts do coexist with mapped homelands, but only after the homelands are reduced and policed and after a key consent clause is overridden in practice. The turning point, then, is where logistical arithmetic statute and winter combine. Rations and riverboats solve the Army's supply problem and create a dependency that agencies use to fix population in place. Congress uses an act to do what a treaty clause forbids without supermajority consent. The weather closes the options for families caught between hunger and enforcement. That is why the year 1807 stands as the hinge in this chain. It is the moment when structural forces described earlier override the words on the 1868 page, and when a frontier of forts and trails becomes a grid of agencies and rules. Spring 1807 on the Missouri River, the rules on paper became rules on the ground. Agency police enforced disarmament at issue gates. Army detachments escorted transfers north from White River to Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Lower Brule, and Crow Creek. The Black Hills were declared open under a new statute, even though the 1868 consent clause still sat in the treaty text. The legal hinge was simple. A treaty had required 3/4 consent by adult men for any future cession. A later act asserted congressional power to change the map without that consent. The boundary that had once encircled the Great Sioux Reservation was then carved into separate jurisdictions. The 1889 agreement drew Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Cheyenne, River, Standing Rock, and Lower Brule out of the older reserve and assigned meets and bounds to each with rations and annuities tied to the new agency sites. Map plates from that agreement became the working geography for surveys, rail spurs, and timber leases through the 1890s. Administration hardened alongside land policy. The General Allotment Act of 1887 authorized individual allotments on communal land and opened the remainder to non-Indian entry. Agents kept rolls to determine who received parcels and how many acres per household. In practice, allotment fragmented the land base and pushed grazing and mineral rights into federal leasing regimes that served outside ranchers and claimants first. On agency ledgers, the first decade after the 1876 campaign reads as logistics and health. Flour, coffee, and beef on the hoof arrived by steamboat as soon as ice cleared. Issue days were recorded in pounds per person per month. When freighting lagged or appropriations ran short, rations fell and families moved to creek bottoms to cut willows for shelter. Census counts rose at river agencies after the consolidation orders, but births fell in bad ration years and deaths spiked in measles and lung sickness seasons in canvas camps. These details recur in the annual reports of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for 1807 and the years that followed. School regimes grew from small mission rooms to a federal system that sent children to boarding schools far from home. The policy aim was assimilation through language bans and labor training. Department investigations now confirm at least 973 child deaths at federal boarding schools and document marked and unmarked burial sites at dozens of campuses. Survivors remember the loss of the names language and kin networks and the long echo of that loss in families who returned to reservation towns, speaking little of what happened. Law and claims work continued in parallel. In 1980, the Supreme Court affirmed a monetary judgment for the unlawful taking of the Black Hills, including interest back to 18 on a principal value computed at the time. The award sits in trust because the Sioux Nation has declined payment rather than extinguish claims to land. The case remains the clearest statement in United States law that the hills were taken without the consent required by the 1868 language. On the land itself, the aftermath is visible as leases, cuts, and spurs. Timber permits and grazing contracts followed the 1889 boundaries. Short rail spurs ran to agency warehouses and to mine camps in the hills. Hunting clauses that once promised rights on unoccupied lands became inert when bison herds collapsed and private claims fenced water and hay. Families adapted by working as agency freighters, herders, and woodcutters while keeping ceremonies within the lines agents would allow. When ceremonies were driven underground, memory moved to quieter forms. Cultural continuance never stopped. Winter counts marked the hard years around 1807 with a sparing hand. A small lodge for the agency move, or a bison skull for the year, meat was short. Ledger art recorded new scenes, trains crossing old trails, agency issue lines, bluecoats burning cash pits. Museums and community programs now show both the older hide paintings and the later ledger pages, alongside new works in the same narrative tradition. A winter count is a calendar history in images one event for each year kept by a designated keeper. That practice continued across the reservation era, and lives today in community archives and classrooms. Demography shifted as policy narrowed. Some bands crossed into British territory to avoid arrests and ration leverage, then returned under pressure of hunger and policing to be counted and placed. Others stayed near the Missouri from the start, to keep elders and children close to clinics and issue points. Each winter the burden fell on the youngest and oldest when freighting ran late or beef herds were thin. Each summer people stretched the lines by following traditional routes to timber-berry grounds and prayer sites, moving at night or with permits when agents would sign them. When language was pushed out of schoolrooms, families kept it in kitchens and at wakes. When a name could not be spoken at roll call, it went into a winter count. Across generations, the legal and administrative frames set in the 1870s carried forward. Reservation boundaries defined voting districts and school bus routes. Allotment titles complicated credit for ranchers and homeowners when fractionated interests piled up. Federal leasing decisions set prices for grass and gravel. Indian Health Service clinics handled outbreaks with thin budgets, while tribal public health programs tried to address diabetes and lung disease linked to long-term poverty. The ledger of harm always included the winter after 1876 when horse strings were week rations short and agencies moved. The present is not only ledger and law, it is also work on language and ceremony. Oglala Lakota, Oyate today is centered at Pine Ridge with tribal government campus and programs in education, health, and policing that reach into every district. Partners and tribal colleges run language classes, immersion classrooms, and teacher training to rebuild fluency among children who are now several generations removed from the boarding school ban. Continuance also means the public record keeps changing. The 1868 treaty page is now presented by the National Archives as a milestone document with Article 12 explained in plain text. The Black Hills Act of 1807 sits online in the statutes at large for anyone to read. The 1889 agreement's metes and bounds for each reservation are posted in the Oklahoma State University Treaty Portal that many tribal researchers use to check lines and clauses against family stories and allotment records. The General Allotment Act is linked to its later amendments in the Government Publishing Office Compendium so that readers can see how a 19th century statute still shapes titles today. These are not abstractions. They are the rules still felt in every land office visit and every grazing lease renewal. Memory work continues in community. Winter count keepers and artists frame the same story in images so it can be taught without a lecture and grasped by children. Museums now present winter counts and ledger books alongside contemporary works that show cell phones at powwows and survey flags at prayer sites underlining continuity instead of rupture. The arc from Horse Creek to the hills is in those pictures as well as in case law. Set against the causes named earlier, the continuance is logical if painful. Rail and homestead laws pulled population through buffalo country. The buffalo crash removed the seasonal cushion that once let hunting carry people through lean years. The shift to interior and the end of treaty making as a constitutional form allowed agreements and riders to act like treaties without the same consent standard. When the hard winter of 1876 to 1807 met those forces, consolidation and statute followed. What remains is a map made by those choices and a record of resistance and survival, written in ledgers and statutes and in winter counts that communities still keep. Scholarly work converges on three conclusions. First, the frontier treaty cycle created a legal and administrative architecture that outlived the forts that birthed it. Articles promising roads agencies annuities and hunting rights fixed names and boundaries that later statutes and courts continued to invoke. Second, the seizure of the Black Hills in 1870, despite the 3/4 consent rule written in 1868, marks a decisive breach. Historians treat it as a textbook case of statute overriding treaty obligation while leaving the treaty's language intact. Third, structural forces named in the mid-century, record railroads, mineral rushes, homestead policy, and the Buffalo Crash drove outcomes as much as any single commander or council, turning consent into a function of rations, logistics, and timing. Points of contention remain. Some emphasize commissioners who sought workable peace within their brief, arguing that large multi-tribe councils validated boundaries that later protected certain claims. Others stress that signature lists never captured true political consent across decentralized nations, and that crucial clauses were interpreted through agency interest. Numbers also divide the literature. Casualty ranges in 1864 to 1876 actions, annuity shortfalls by pound per person, and the scale of non-combatant losses in the consolidation winters are still debated because reporting was uneven and families removed their dead from fields and camps. The role of particular leaders is read differently across sources. One strand credits headmen who pursued agency survival under extreme pressure. Another foregrounds war leaders who preserved freedom of movement long enough to secure more favorable terms for their bands. The enduring legacy is mixed but traceable. In doctrine, the period hardens two pillars that still shape Indian law: congressional plenary power over Indian affairs and the federal trust responsibility. The first explains how the 1807 Act succeeded despite contrary treaty text. The second underwrites later claims that seek compensation or redress for violations. In reform, the record of broken promises contributed to 20th century policy pivots from allotment and boarding schools towards self-determination, tribal courts, and language revitalization. In symbol, Article 12 of the 1868 treaty becomes a touchstone for sovereignty discourse. Winter counts carry the memory of short beef, and agency moves and the Black Hills stand as a living claim rather than a closed case. The same map plates that once routed wagon trains now guide cultural programs, land-back negotiations, and co-management agreements for sacred sites. Placed in the long arc, the treaties of 1851 to 1868 and the 1877 removal transformed a moving geography into a contested paper landscape, whose clauses, breaches, and court findings still structure life on the northern and southern plains. This episode endures because it shows how words set to protect homelands were bent by rail and gold into instruments of loss, and how those same words still anchor the fight to define land law and memory today. We close the Frontier Treaties arc with an open question: what should be restored, land access rights, or both? What's your view on the 1980 Black Hills decision? Which Northwest treaty should we cover next? Comment below. Thanks for watching.